Chapter 12. An examination of the question where the ruling principle is to be considered to reside, wherein also is a discussion of tears and laughter, and a physiological speculation as to the interrelation of matter, nature, and mind. Let there be an end, then, of all the vain and conjectural discussion of those who confine the intelligible energy to certain bodily organs, of whom some lay it down that the ruling principle is in the heart, while others say that the mind resides in the brain, strengthening such opinions by some plausible superficialities. For he who ascribes the principal authority to the heart makes its local position evidence of his argument, because it seems that it somehow occupies the middle position of the body, on the ground that the notion of the will is easily distributed from the center to the whole body, and so proceeds to operation, and he makes the troublesome and passionate disposition of man a testimony for his argument, because such affections seem to move this part sympathetically. Those, on the other hand, who consecrate the brain to reasoning, say that the head has been built by nature as a kind of citadel of the whole body, and that in it the mind dwells like a king, with a bodyguard of senses surrounding it like messengers and shield-bearers. And these find a sign of their opinion in the fact that the reasoning of those who have suffered some injury to the membrane of the brain is abnormally distorted, and that those whose heads are heavy with intoxication ignore what is seemly. Each of those who uphold these views puts forward some reasons of a more physical character on behalf of his opinion concerning the ruling principle. One declares that the motion which proceeds from the understanding is in some way akin to the nature of fire, because fire and the understanding are alike in perpetual motion, and since heat is allowed to have its source in the region of the heart, he says on this ground that the motion of the mind is compounded with the mobility of heat, and asserts that the heart, in which heat is enclosed, is the receptacle of the intelligent nature. The other declares that the cerebral membrane, for so they call the tissue that surrounds the brain, is as it were a foundation or root of all the senses, and hereby makes good his own argument, on the ground that the intellectual energy cannot have its seat save in that part, where the ear connected with it comes into concussion with the sounds that fall upon it. And the sight, which naturally belongs to the hollow of the place where the eyes are situated, makes its internal representation by means of the images that fall upon the pupils, while the qualities of sense are discerned in it by being drawn in through the nose, and the sense of taste is tried by the test of the cerebral membrane, which sends down from itself by the vertebrae of the neck sensitive nerve processes to the isthmoidal passage, and unites them with the muscles there. I admit it to be true that the intellectual part of the soul is often disturbed by prevalence of passions, and that the reason is blunted by some bodily accident so as to hinder its natural operation, and that the heart is a sort of source of the fiery element in the body, and is moved in correspondence with the impulses of passion. And moreover, in addition to this, I do not reject, as I hear very much the same account from those who spend their time in anatomical researches, the statement that the cerebral membrane, according to the theory of those who take such a physiological view, enfolding in itself the brain and steeped in the vapors that issue from it, forms a foundation for the senses. Yet I do not hold this for a proof that the incorporeal nature is bounded by any limits of place. Certainly, we are aware that mental aberrations do not arise from heaviness of head alone, but skilled physicians declare that our intellect is also weakened by the membranes that underlie the sides being affected by disease, when they call the disease frenzy, since the name given to those membranes is phrenes, and the sensation resulting from sorrow is mistakenly supposed to arise at the heart, for while it is not the heart, but the entrance of the belly that is pained, people ignorantly refer the affection to the heart. Those, however, who have carefully studied the affections in question, give some such account as follows. By a compression and closing of the pores, which naturally takes place over the whole body in a condition of grief, everything that meets a hindrance in its passage is driven to the cavities in the interior of the body, and hence also, as the respiratory organs too are pressed by what surrounds them, the drawing of breath often becomes more violent under the influence of nature endeavoring to widen what has been contracted, so as to open out the compressed passages, and such breathing we consider a symptom of grief, and call it a groan or a shriek. That, moreover, which appears to oppress the region of the heart is a painful affection, not of the heart, but of the entrance of the stomach, and occurs from the same cause, I mean that of the compression of the pores, as the vessel that contains the bile, contracting, pours that bitter and pungent juice upon the entrance of the stomach, and a proof of this is that the complexion of those in grief becomes sallow and jaundiced, as the bile pours its own juice into the veins by reason of excessive pressure. Furthermore, the opposite affection, that I mean of mirth and laughter, contributes to establish the argument. For the pores of the body, in the case of those who are dissolved in mirth by hearing something pleasant, are also somehow dissolved and relaxed. Just as in the former case, the slight and insensible exhalations of the pores are checked by grief, and as they compress the internal arrangement of the higher viscera, drive up towards the head and the cerebral membrane the humid vapor which, being retained in excess by the cavities of the brain, is driven out by the pores at its base, while the closing of the eyelids expels the moisture in the form of drops, and the drop is called a tear. So I would have you think that when the pores, as a result of the contrary condition, are unusually widened, some air is drawn in through them into the interior, and thence again expelled by nature through the passage of the mouth, while all the viscera, and especially as they say the liver, join in expelling this air by a certain agitation and throbbing motion. Whence it comes that nature, contriving to give facility for the exit of the air, widens the passage of the mouth, extending the cheeks on either side round about the breath, and the result is called laughter. We must not then, on this account, ascribe the ruling principle any more to the liver than we must think, because of the heated state of the blood about the heart and wrathful dispositions, that the seat of the mind is in the heart. But we must refer these matters to the character of our bodily organization, and consider that the mind is equally in contact with each of the parts according to a kind of combination which is indescribable. Even if any should allege to us on this point the Scripture which claims the ruling principle for the heart, we shall not receive the statement without examination. For he who makes mention of the heart speaks also of the reins, when he says, God trieth the hearts and reins, so that they must either confine the intellectual principle to the two combined, or to neither. And although I am aware that the intellectual energies are blunted, or even made altogether ineffective in a certain condition of the body, I do not hold this a sufficient evidence for limiting the faculty of the mind by any particular place, so that it should be forced out of its proper amount of free space by any inflammations that may arise in the neighboring parts of the body. For such an opinion is a corporeal one, that when the receptacle is already occupied by something placed in it, nothing else can find place there. For the intelligible nature neither dwells in the empty spaces of bodies, nor is extruded by encroachments of the flesh. But since the whole body is made like some musical instrument, just as it often happens in the case of those who know how to play, but are unable, because the unfitness of the instrument does not admit of their art, to show their skill, for that which is destroyed by time, or broken by a fall, or rendered useless by rust or decay, is mute and inefficient, even if it be breathed upon by one who may be an excellent artist in flute playing. So too the mind, passing over the whole instrument and touching each of the parts in a mode corresponding to its intellectual activities according to its nature, produces its proper effect on those parts which are in a natural condition, but remains inoperative and ineffective upon those which are unable to admit the movement of its art. For the mind is somehow naturally adapted to be in close relation with that which is in a natural condition, but to be alien from that which is removed from nature. And here I think there is a view of the matter more close to nature, by which we may learn something of the more refined doctrines. For since the most beautiful and supreme good of all is the divinity itself, to which incline all things that have a tendency towards what is beautiful and good, we therefore say that the mind, as being in the image of the most beautiful, itself also remains in beauty and goodness, so long as it partakes as far as is possible in its likeness to the archetype. But if it were at all to depart from this, it is deprived of that beauty in which it was. And as we said, that the mind was adorned by the likeness of the archetypal beauty, being formed as though it were a mirror to receive the figure of that which it expresses, we consider that the nature which is governed by it is attached to the mind in the same relation, and that it too is adorned by the beauty that the mind gives, being, so to say, a mirror of the mirror, and that by it is swayed and sustained the material element of that existence in which the nature is contemplated. Thus, so long as one keeps in touch with the other, the communication of the true beauty extends proportionally through the whole series, beautifying by the superior nature that which comes next to it. But when there is any interruption of this beneficent connection, or when, on the contrary, the superior comes to follow the inferior, then is displayed the misshapen character of matter, when it is isolated from nature. For in itself matter is a thing without form or structure, and by its shapelessness is also destroyed that beauty of nature with which it is adorned through the mind. And so the transmission of the ugliness of matter reaches through the nature to the mind itself, so that the image of God is no longer seen in the figure expressed by that which was molded according to it. For the mind, setting the idea of good like a mirror behind the back, turns off the incident rays of the effulgence of the good, and it receives into itself the impress of the shapelessness of matter. And in this way is brought about the genesis of evil, arising through the withdrawal of that which is beautiful and good. Now all is beautiful and good that is closely related to the first good, but that which departs from its relation and likeness to this is certainly devoid of beauty and goodness. If then, according to the statement we have been considering, that which is truly good is one, and the mind itself also has its power of being beautiful and good, in so far as it is the image of the good and beautiful, and the nature which is sustained by the mind has the like power, in so far as it is an image of the image, it is hereby shown that our material part holds together and is upheld when it is controlled by nature, and on the other hand is dissolved and disorganized when it is separated from that which upholds and sustains it, and is dissevered from its conjunction with beauty and goodness. Now such a condition as this does not arise except when there takes place an overturning of nature to the opposite state, in which the desire has no inclination for beauty and goodness, but for that which is in need of the adorning element. For it must needs be that that which is made like to matter, destitute as matter is of form of its own, should be assimilated to it in respect of the absence alike of form and of beauty. We have, however, discussed these points in passing, as following on our argument, since they were introduced by our speculation on the point before us. For the subject of inquiry was whether the intellectual faculty has its seat in any of the parts of us, or extends equally over them all. For as for those who shut up the mind locally in parts of the body, and who advance for the establishment of this opinion of theirs the fact that the reason has not free course in the case of those whose cerebral membranes are in an unnatural condition, our argument showed that in respect of every part of the compound nature of man, whereby every man has some natural operation, the power of the soul remains equally ineffective if the part does not continue in its natural condition. And thus there came into our argument, following out this line of thought, the view we have just stated, by which we learn that in the compound nature of man, the mind is governed by God, and that by it is governed our material life, provided the latter remains in its natural state. But if it is perverted from nature, it is alienated also from that operation, which is carried on by the mind. Let us return, however, once more to the point from which we started, that in those who are not perverted from their natural condition by some affection, the mind exercises its own power, and is established firmly in those who are in sound health, but on the contrary is powerless in those who do not admit its operation. For we may confirm our opinion on these matters by yet other arguments, and if it is not tedious for those to hear who are already wearied with our discourse, we shall discuss these matters also, so far as we are able in a few words. Chapter 13. A rationale of sleep, of yawning, and of dreams. This life of our bodies, material and subject to flux, always advancing by way of motion, finds the power of its being in this, that it never rests from its motion, and as some river flowing on by its own impulse keeps the channel in which it runs well filled, yet is not seen in the same water always at the same place, but part of it glides away, while part comes flowing on, so too the material element of our life here suffers change in the continuity of its succession of opposites, by way of motion and flux, so that it never can desist from change, but in its inability to rest keeps us unceasingly in motion, alternating by like ways. And if it should ever cease moving, it will assuredly have cessation also of its being. For instance, emptiness succeeds fullness, and on the other hand, after emptiness comes in turn a process of filling. Sleep relaxes the strain of waking, and again awakening braces up what had become slack, and neither of these abides continually, but both give way, each at the other's coming. Nature, thus by their interchange, so renewing herself as, while partaking of each in turn, to pass from the one to the other without break. For that the living creature should always be exerting itself in its operations produces a certain rupture and severance of the overstrained part, and continual quiescence of the body brings about a certain dissolution and laxity in its frame. But to be in touch with each of these at the proper times in a moderate degree is a staying power of nature, which, by continual transference to the opposed states, gives herself in each of them rest from the other. Thus she finds the body on the strain through wakefulness, and devises relaxation for the strain by means of sleep, giving the perceptive faculties rest for the time from their operations, loosing them like horses from the chariots after the race. Further, rest at proper times is necessary for the framework of the body, that the nutriment may be diffused over the whole body through the passages which it contains, without any strain to hinder its progress. For just as certain misty vapors are drawn up from the recesses of the earth when it is soaked with rain, whenever the sun heats it with rays of any considerable warmth, so a similar result happens in the earth that is in us. When the nutriment within is heated up by natural warmth, and the vapors being naturally of upward tendency and airy nature, and aspiring to that which is above them, come to be in the region of the head like smoke penetrating the joints of a wall, Then they are dispersed thence by exhalation to the passages of the organs of sense, and by them the senses are of course rendered inactive, giving way to the transit of these vapors. For the eyes are pressed upon by the eyelids when some leaden instrument, as it were, I mean such a weight as that I have spoken of, lets down the eyelid upon the eyes, and the hearing, being dulled by these same vapors, as though a door were placed upon the acoustic organs, rests from its natural operation, and such a condition is sleep, when the sense is at rest in the body and altogether ceases from the operation of its natural motion, so that the digestive processes of nutriment may have free course for transmission by the vapors through each of the passages. And for this reason, if the apparatus of the organs of sense should be closed and sleep hindered by some occupation, the nervous system becoming filled with the vapors is naturally and spontaneously extended, so that the part which has had its density increased by the vapors is rarefied by the process of extension, just as those do who squeeze the water out of clothes by vehement wringing. And seeing that the parts about the pharynx are somewhat circular, and nervous tissue abounds there, whenever there is need for the expulsion from that part of the density of the vapors, since it is impossible that the part which is circular in shape should be separated directly, but only by being distended in the outline of its circumference. For this reason, by checking the breath in a yawn, the chin is moved downwards, so as to leave a hollow to the uvula, and all the interior parts being arranged in the figure of a circle, that smoky denseness which had been detained in the neighboring parts is emitted together with the exit of the breath. And often the like may happen even after sleep, when any portion of these vapors remains in the region spoken of, undigested and unexhaled. Hence the mind of man clearly proves its claim to connection with his nature, itself also cooperating and moving with the nature in its sound and waking state, but remaining unmoved when it is abandoned to sleep, unless anyone supposes that the imagery of dreams is a motion of the mind exercised in sleep. We for our part say that it is only the conscious and sound action of the intellect which we ought to refer to mind, and as to the fantastic nonsense which occurs to us in sleep, we suppose that some appearances of the operations of the mind are accidentally molded in the less rational part of the soul. For the soul, being by sleep dissociated from the senses, is also of necessity outside the range of the operations of the mind, for it is through the senses that the union of mind with man takes place. Therefore, when the senses are at rest, the intellect also must needs be inactive, and an evidence of this is the fact that the dreamer often seems to be in absurd and impossible situations, which would not happen if the soul were then guided by reason and intellect. It seems to me, however, that when the soul is at rest so far as concerns its more excellent faculties, so far, I mean, as concerns the operation of mind and sense, the nutritive part of it alone is operative during sleep, and that some shadows and echoes of those things which happen in our waking moments, of the operations both of sense and of intellect, which are impressed upon it by that part of the soul which is capable of memory, that these, I say, are pictured as chance will have it, some echo of memory still lingering in this division of the soul. With these, then, the man is beguiled, not led to acquaintance with the things that present themselves by any train of thought, but wandering among confused and inconsequent delusions. But just as in his bodily operations, while each of the parts individually acts in some way according to the power which naturally resides in it, there arises also in the limb that is at rest a state sympathetic with that which is in motion. Similarly, in the case of the soul, even if one part is at rest and another in motion, the whole is affected in sympathy with the part. For it is not possible that the natural unity should be in any way severed, though one of the faculties included in it is in turn supreme in virtue of its active operation. But as when men are awake and busy, the mind is supreme, and sense ministers to it, yet the faculty which regulates the body is not dissociated from them, for the mind furnishes the food for its wants, the sense receives what is furnished, and the nutritive faculty of the body appropriates to itself that which is given to it. So in sleep the supremacy of these faculties is in some way reversed in us, and while the less rational becomes supreme, the operation of the other ceases indeed, yet is not absolutely extinguished. But while the nutritive faculty is then busied with digestion during sleep, and keeps all our nature occupied with itself, the faculty of sense is neither entirely separated from it, for that cannot be separated, which has once been naturally joined, nor yet can its activity revive, as it is hindered by the inaction during sleep of the organs of sense, and by the same reasoning, the mind also being united to the sensitive part of the soul, it would follow that we should say that the mind moves with the latter when it is in motion, and rests with it when it is quiescent. As naturally happens with fire, when it is heaped over with chaff and no breath fans the flame, it neither consumes what lies beside it, nor is entirely quenched, but instead of flame it rises to the air through the chaff in the form of smoke. Yet if it should obtain any breath of air, it turns the smoke to flame. In the same way, the mind, when hidden by the inaction of the senses, in sleep, is neither able to shine out through them, nor yet is quite extinguished, but has, so to say, a smoldering activity, operating to a certain extent, but unable to operate farther. Again, as a musician, when he touches with the plectrum the slackened strings of a lyre, brings out no orderly melody, for that which is not stretched will not sound. But his hand frequently moves skillfully, bringing the plectrum to the position of the notes so far as place is concerned, yet there is no sound, except that he produces by the vibration of the strings a sort of uncertain and indistinct hum. So in sleep the mechanism of the senses being relaxed, the artist is either quite inactive, if the instrument is completely relaxed by satiety or heaviness, or will act slackly and faintly, if the instrument of the senses does not fully admit of the exercise of its art. For this cause memory is confused, and foreknowledge, though rendered doubtful by uncertain veils, is imagined in shadows of our waking pursuits, and often indicates to us something of what is going to happen. For by its subtlety of nature, the mind has some advantage in ability to behold things over more corporeal grossness. Yet it cannot make its meaning clear by direct methods, so that the information of the matter in hand should be plain and evident, but its declaration of the future is ambiguous and doubtful, what those who interpret such things call an enigma. So the butler presses the cluster for Pharaoh's cup, so the baker seemed to carry his baskets, each supposing himself in sleep to be engaged in those services with which he was busied when awake. For the images of their customary occupations, imprinted on the prescient element of their soul, gave them for a time the power of foretelling, by this sort of prophecy on the part of the mind, what should come to pass. But if Daniel and Joseph and others like them were instructed by divine power, without any confusion of perception in the knowledge of things to come, this is nothing to the present statement. For no one would ascribe this to the power of dreams, since he will be constrained as a consequence to suppose that those divine appearances also which took place in wakefulness were not a miraculous vision, but a result of nature brought about spontaneously. As then, while all men are guided by their own minds, there are some few who are deemed worthy of evident divine communication. So while the imagination of sleep naturally occurs in a like and equivalent manner for all, some, not all, share by means of their dreams in some more divine manifestation. But to all the rest, even if a foreknowledge of anything does occur as a result of dreams, it occurs in the way we have spoken of. And again, if the Egyptian and the Assyrian king were guided by God to the knowledge of the future, the dispensation wrought by their means is a different thing, for it was necessary that the hidden wisdom of the holy men should be made known, that each of them might not pass his life without profit to the state. For how could Daniel have been known for what he was, if the soothsayers and magicians had not been unequal to the task of discovering the dream? And how could Egypt have been preserved while Joseph was shut up in prison, if his interpretation of the dream had not brought him to notice? Thus we must reckon these cases as exceptional, and not class them with common dreams. But this ordinary seeing of dreams is common to all men, and arises in our fancies in different modes and forms. For either there remain, as we have said, in the reminiscent part of the soul, the echoes of daily occupations, or as often happens, the constitution of dreams is framed with regard to such and such a condition of the body, for thus the thirsty man seems to be among springs, the man who is in need of food to be at a feast, and the young man in the heat of youthful vigor is beset by fancies corresponding to his passion. I also knew another cause of the fancies of sleep, when attending one of my relations attacked by frenzy, who, being annoyed by food being given him in too great quantity for his strength, kept crying out and finding fault with those who were about him for filling intestines with dung and putting them upon him. And when his body was rapidly tending to perspire, he blamed those who were with him for having water ready to wet him with as he lay. And he did not cease calling out till the result showed the meaning of these complaints. For all at once a copious sweat broke out over his body, and a relaxation of bowels explained the weight in the intestines. The same condition, then, which while his sober judgment was dulled by disease, his nature underwent, being sympathetically affected by the condition of the body, not being without perception of what was amiss, but being unable clearly to express its pain, by reason of the distraction resulting from the disease. This, probably, if the intelligent principle of the soul were lulled to rest, not from infirmity but by natural sleep, might appear as a dream to one similarly situated, the breaking out of perspiration being expressed by water, and the pain occasioned by the food, by the weight of intestines. This view also is taken by those skilled in medicine, that according to the differences of complaints, the visions of dreams appear differently to the patients, that the visions of those of weak stomach are of one kind, those of persons suffering from injury to the cerebral membrane of another, those of persons in fevers of yet another, that those of patients suffering from bilious and from phlegmatic affections are diverse, and those again of plethoric patients, and of patients in wasting disease are different. Whence we may see that the nutritive and vegetative faculty of the soul has in it by commixture some seed of the intelligent element, which is in some sense brought into likeness to the particular state of the body, being adapted in its fancies according to the complaint which has seized upon it. Moreover, most men's dreams are conformed to the state of their character. The brave man's fancies are of one kind, the coward's of another, the wanton man's dreams of one kind, the continent man's of another. The liberal man and the avaricious man are subject to different fancies. Well, these fancies are nowhere framed by the intellect, but by the less rational disposition of the soul, which forms even in dreams the semblances of those things to which each is accustomed by the practice of his waking hours.